Welcome everybody, I'm John Wally, and today we're going to be diving into our Tenable OT series covering the area of policies and events. So far we've walked through implementation, we've walked through configurations of our virtual, both our sensors and our core appliance. We've talked a little bit about how to get data into our labs if we're not rolling into a production environment. So today we're going to work more in the interface. We're going to be talking about how to get clean data. So let's jump in. So I'm going to log in here. And we can get started. Now, if you've done this and you follow along in episode 5, we talked about how to get some good data in here to play with. If you've rolled into a production environment and you've been running for a few hours and your traffic's good coming in from your sensor or into your core appliance, you should have some data to play with now. Now, before we jump in and say, wow, we have all these vulnerabilities, I can see all this risk, yay, we won, we're done. I want to pause you. We're not done. And a lot of times when I'm working with customers in this area, I find that they immediately end up reacting to some of the risk scores that are out here. You see all this red with the criticals and highs and like risk in the 71 area. And so a lot of times that's where our eyes go, not realizing that really the tool itself truly isn't tuned yet. And so Tenable OT, like other security tools, are out there and it's garbage in, garbage out. So we're going to spend this episode talking about how do we clean up the data? Because what we're going to do is we'll work on our events, we'll work on our policies, we'll make sure that the events that are coming up are accurate, and then we're going to wipe the data. And I know that sounds scary. It's like, well, but we have all this stuff. It's all right. We'll gather that data again, but we want to make sure it's good because we don't want this overload on our cybersecurity analyst. If we were to integrate this tool, get it rolled out, and they see thousands and thousands of events coming in, they're going to get fatigued. They're going to realize that the data is not accurate, and they're going to stop acting on that data, which is the worst thing that could happen. So we really want the data that's getting up to your SOC or going into your SIM or going into your vulnerability management program, that it's actionable data, and you're not getting all this noise that goes back and forth that we're not really able to do something about or to mitigate that risk in some way. So today we're going to be focusing on primarily two policies, two types of events, and then we'll talk about how to monitor and to make sure that those are fixed over initially and over time. These two policies that we're going to be talking about are the two policies that create the most noise. They're also two of the policies that are hardest to fix in some environments. Some it's really easy. Some it can take you months just to get through these two policies, getting them cleaned up. So let's jump into a little bit of the mechanics and how the tool works, and then we'll jump into what those two events are. So let's talk about policies in general. So most of the policies that are out there are in one of two groups. And I would actually say all of the policies are. You have, and let me get rid of some of the search here I was doing to prepare. So there's different types of policies that are out there. So you have your controller activities, controller validation, network events, network threats, and SCADA events. If you look at network threats, all of these are created through an intrusion detection system called Suricata. So Suricata is an open source tool that's built into the back of Tenable OT. So sometimes going through and modifying policies that are tied to network threats can be somewhat difficult. So I'm going to kind of fast forward a little bit so that you know what I'm talking about. We will have episodes in the future about how to modify our Suricata-based policies as well. That's more in depth at what we're covering today. This is just an introduction, but I want to show you the differences in the type of policies that are out there. So if I were to go in and say, hey, I just have these scans and denial of service, for example, or I could have attacks various, for example. If I go in And if you look, the policy name, if I were to click on this policy name, it would bring up a policy. So the question is can we edit this policy? Can we make it in a way that if we see something that's coming in, we know it's not accurate, can we edit it? And the answer is yes, but there's a special way of doing it. By default, anything that is a network category, a network threat category, typically is driven off of Suricata. So if I were to go in and say edit, what you'll find is even though it comes up, I can edit the policy name, the rule group, some of the schedule stuff, the source and destination is grayed out. I can't do anything in here. Well, that's not a great way. Like if I want to say certain things that are showing up as various attacks aren't real attacks, I can't really edit it. So our Suricata-based rules are not editable, or there's certain fields that aren't editable from a direct kind of pathway. So that's why I want to bring that up. We'll talk about how to do that in the future. It's a little more complex, but just know that any of the rules that are based on Suricata events aren't necessarily editable, especially when you talk about source and destination fields. So then what are the other types of policies? So there's other policies and events that are driven specifically from how the Tenable OT system is built and was designed by Endigy. Now, the rule sets in Suricata are also developed by Endigy, but it's a modification of the current rule set that Suricata has, where Tenable OT policies are 100% editable. So instead of looking at policies under, let's say, our network threats, let's say that we have something like network events. So if I were to go in and say, hey, HTTP communications to controllers, and I go to edit this, you'll notice that I am able to edit these fields. And that's because these are specific to the Tenable OT tool and the way it's developed, and not necessarily tied into the Suricata network threat database that's built a little bit separately. So that's some of the mechanics on the back end of policies, understanding that there's two types. There's policies that are driven by Suricata, and then there's policies that are built in by Tenable OT specifically. All right. So what do policies do? Well, policies actually drive events. So time we see anything, hear anything, experience anything on a network from the Tenable OT tool, is it drives a capture of that data. And then that data is analyzed to say, does it trigger an event? It's policies that create these triggers that says this is good or this is bad. You'll even see this as an example with the policy that we have up. It's like, what are our triggered events? So if we see there's a number of triggered events that have come up just for HTTP communications to controllers. If we were to look at the details of this, we can say, what's the policy name? What is the source? What's the destination? What's the protocol? And what's the schedule? So the way that all of our policies are written is it has a source, destination, protocol, and schedule. Now these can be modified for those Tenable OT pieces. Well, it can really be modified for all of them, but especially for the ones that are Tenable OT specific and not Suricata, that these can change at any given time. So each one of these are written as an and statement. And what I mean by that, let's go back to like how policies are written. They're all written under this Boolean type logic. And if you're not familiar with Boolean logic, it's basically comes up to whether you have a true or false statement. There's lots of places on the web to learn about Boolean logic, but the idea is if the source equals one thing, it equals true or false. So for example, if I were to say, let's take a very simple example, 1 plus 1 equals 2. Is that a true or false statement? It's kind of how Boolean works. So that answer would be, in that case, 2 plus 2, or 1 plus 1 is 2. That would be a true statement. But what if I added something else to it? What if I said 1 plus 1 is 2 and 2 plus 2 is 4? Now, is that a true or false statement? So the way it works, if you have an and operator in between that, that would mean both conditions have to be true for the statement to be true. But what if I change this to an or statement? And I said something like 1 plus 1 is 2 and 2 plus 2 is 9. Now, because I used an or statement in there, that condition would still be true because one of those statements are true. So what we're saying is if 1 plus 1 equals 2, or if 2 plus 2 plus equals 9, if either one of those statements are true, the whole statement is true. So you have this and or logic that you'll see in these. Now, that's a lot, especially if you're new to Boolean logic. So all of these are and statements. So the source being any asset, and the destination being in controllers, and the protocol being HTTP, and the schedule being any time. If all of those things are true, then this will fire. So you already have some complexity there because you have all of these conditions have to be true in order for it to fire. So if it were any asset not in the controllers group in HTTP at any time, you would not get a triggered event. Now, this is all conceptual, talking about Boolean and how the policies are written. Let's go look at one. And instead of just talking theoretical, let's talk about two problem policies that Tenable OT ships with that's already out there. If I go into all events, I'm going to look for this word external. And so external, you'll see a couple of policies in here, and I'm going to open this up so you can read it. So communication from an external network and communication to an external network. And this is where I like to start. Well, why would I like to start here? Well, one of the reasons is if we have communication coming in from an external source that's not trusted, and then that's a problem. Well, how do we know if it's trusted or not? And how do we know what's external versus what's internal? And this comes back to one of our previous episodes when we went in and we started talking about our environmental configuration. So the way that Tenable OT decides what's trusted and what's not trusted, what's internal and what's external, is actually something that we've already set up in a previous video. If we go down to local settings and we go to environment configuration and asset settings, what you'll see is we have a monitored network. And that monitored network is what we're telling Tenable OT is what we want to protect. So that's that internal trusted network, or that internal network that we want to monitor. Now there's another piece of this to be aware of, is that any IP address that you have in monitored network is going to count against your license for Tenable. So there's always a balance here of what do you monitor, what do you trust, and how much do you want to spend on a license with Tenable. In this case, because I'm using lab data, in episode 5, we set this up for these two network ranges, the 192.168.34 and the 10.100 networks. Everything else would be considered an external network. So now let's go back to all events. We searched on the word external, and we see all these events that are happening on our external network. Now let's do a little bit of moving and changing some of our interface, because this is a lot of data in front of us. And so one of the big things of getting through and really getting clean, actionable data is to know how to parse and look at that data. And so one of the first things I like to do is actually modify how I'm looking at my events. So if I go over to the far right side, there's a hidden bar, and I don't know why Tenable does this, but it's really hard to see, that's called settings. And it's not actually settings. It's more of like these pane filters that you can go through. So each one of these are a pane, all events, configuration events, SCADA events. Each one of these that pop up, I'm calling a pane within your window. So if you go over to your settings, you'll see that I can change the columns that I have in each row. So to make this a little bit easier to read, I'm going to get rid of the log ID. I'm going to get rid of my source asset because I'm going to have my source address. I'm going to get rid of my destination asset because I have my destination address. I'm going to keep protocol. I'm also going to add a new thing in here called comment. And these are going to be empty right now, but we'll eventually start working with that. And I'm going to close this window out. All right. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move some of these columns around. So I'm going to take this status column and I'm going to drag it all the way over to right before comments. And this will help me like move around and filter things a little better. All right, we don't have to slide back and forth. We can see everything on one screen. It just makes it a little easier to work with the data. The second thing I want to do is go to this column heading on each one of these areas that we have now on our screen. And you'll see as I hover over each one of these, you're gonna get this little filter icon that pops up. And you'll see as we walk through each one, you'll get this filter. And it looks like we may have a filter here that's any right now, that's fine. Now, if I click on any particular row, let's say it's time or event type or severity, you'll see this arrow that pops up. And this little arrow will tell you how this is sorting. Is it sorting ascending or descending? And we can change that just by clicking on the name. So we can sort in any one of these columns in ascending or descending order. So if I'm looking for a specific set of source addresses and I want them in order, or policy names and I want them in order, I can click on these and then they will sort for me. All right, but I can also do more than that. I can actually go through and sort multiple areas. So let's say that the first thing I want to do is my source address. So I am going to go in and you can see I'm sorting and it's in a descending order. But what if I wanted to group my destination addresses as well? Well, one of the things I can do is I can hold down my control key, or if you're on a Mac, it would be a command key. And if I click the heading for this, I can actually have a double sort. So what that allows me to do is I'm primarily sorting on my source address, but then I have a secondary sort on my destination. Well, this is good for me to have because I can see my source addresses are all in order, and then my destination addresses are all in order following that. Now, right now, it may not make a lot of sense why I'm doing this, but as I start modifying policies or working with policies, it means that I can actually resolve these in order and make sure that I'm not missing out on anything that's happening. I'm making sure that I'm capturing all the sources in order, all the destinations in order. And you can continue to sort this in multiple groups. So then let's say I want to do a tertiary sort, I can do that on protocol. Now I have 3 sorts that are across my columns. Now usually that's excessive. You don't need more than 2, but the list could go on as many sorts as you wanted to have across there. Now I'm going to just click on this so that I go back to only sorting on one column. I'm going to go to my policy name, and remember that filter icon we had? We can actually click on this. And this will give us currently anything that has to do with external. It'll give us an option for all of the different things that we can capture on this slide. Now, one of the areas that I want to filter on first is the policy communication from external networks, because that's going to be one of our most problematic areas. I'm going to click apply, and now you'll see we only have the policy name for external network. The other thing that you'll notice is now we have this icon right beside the policy name. And if I hover over it, you'll see I get the secondary icon over here. So this first icon is just telling me that I have a filter on this column. The second icon is how I can modify that filter. I know that's not super user friendly, and hopefully Tenable changes that in the future, but just know if you click on this, it's just going to sort. That actually little filter icon doesn't do anything. You always want to select the second filter if you want to modify that filter for that column in any way. All right, so now that we're filtered on external, I'm going to sort on my source address, and then I'm going to do a secondary sort on my destination address. And I'm going to draw your attention to some immediate bad information that we see. So remember we said when we trigger on something, that means it's an event that we're going to eventually send up to our cybersecurity professionals, our analysts, and they're going to say either this is good or bad. And remember we said in our asset settings that we said what's our internal trusted network and what's our external trusted network. So one of the ones that we said was a 192.168 address was part of our internal and external. And so if we go look at this, and we can say 192.168.34, if I go back and look at my events, you'll see this is not 34. So this is not, neither one of these addresses are in our monitored network. So why in the world are we tracking this? It's not coming into an industrial environment. It's not a risk to our environment. We're probably picking up some secondary information that could be good for us to know that we're probably not segmented as well as we thought we were. But in reality, we don't have anything talking to our industrial network. This is something we're picking up on another network that probably has a firewall rule or something that's set up that we probably shouldn't even be seeing this data, but we are. But should this be counting against a license? Should this be showing up in our network? How is somebody going to react to this? We're really not tracking this in a proper way. Because really what we're saying, this is communication from an external network into our industrial and controlled environment, but that's not true. That's not what we're seeing here. So what we need to do is fix this data so it's actually real. So there's a couple of ways to do this. The best way is to modify the policy. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to click on communication from external here, and this will take us directly to the policy. You'll see on the left-hand side, it's jumped us down to the policy menu. It's taken us specifically to this policy, and now we can go in and we can edit this function. Now, before I walk through the editing process, I want to draw your attention to one other thing. You'll see the status of this is now in an off state. You'll see that this button or this slider is over to the left, and we have this warning symbol beside it. If you hover over that, it will tell you that this policy has generated too many events and was disabled by the system. So whenever Tenable OT sees an event that happens over and over and over again within 60 seconds, it will turn it off because it's generating so many events that it's problematic, and we don't want to fill up logs or cause system performance issues. It goes into the log, and if you go into system logs, you'll see this, where it says that policy ID has been turned on or turned off. Here we'll see the policy ID has generated too many hits and it's turned off. So now as an administrator, you'll know you'll have a problem that this came in, that we had too many hits on a policy. It's probably a bad policy, and it means we need to edit it. So this will come up in your logs as you know that that's happened. So let's go back to all events. We see all of our events coming in from external. We have them in order. So now we know we can go in and we can edit this policy. Now there's one other way to find this, is we can go in and we can actually look at the policies themselves. Now, if you look at each one of these, I can go through and I can filter on my status just like I did in the other. Here I'm going to filter on my policies that are turned off. I'm going to apply this. And now you can see all the policies that have been turned off because of some configuration problem. Now we're not going to be focusing on all of these today. We're only going to be focusing on 2, but you would follow the same process for going through and doing these minus your network threats. Don't get into network threats yet because that'll be a different episode on how to fix those. But anything under your network events that are triggering is something that needs to be investigated and fixed for this first area. So we'll probably have a couple of episodes on these, and then we'll walk into network threats and have an episode or 2 there as well. So we will get there, I promise. But this is another way of knowing that we have a problem with one of our policies on our OT system. All right. So as I promised, we're going to go to events, we're going to go to our policy, and now we're going to edit our policy. So how do we need to edit it, and what is this Boolean logic that we've been talking about? So the first thing we'll notice is that we're saying that if any device, if anything talks on our network that's not in monitored networks, we want to know about. So that's our first check. If there's an asset, if there's a device, if there's something that's not in that monitored network that we identified below, we want to know, and that's the first trigger. So we see something talking and it's not on our monitored network. The second condition that's an and statement, and it's in any asset. Well, This means that anything that talks that's not in our monitor group, that's talking to anything, even if it's not in our monitor group, is going to equal true. Because we're saying if it's not in monitored assets and it's in anything and it's in any protocol and it happens at any time, then true. So by default, there's a flaw in this policy. What we really want to say is if there's something not in our monitored assets network that's talking to something that is in our monitored assets network, we want to know about it. So this will fix this policy so that it only measures stuff that's external talking to something that's internal. Now, hopefully this is something that Tenable will fix in the future. If this is fixed when you're watching this video, good for Tenable. I'm glad they fixed this. But this was a general problem in the logic with these two policies. And the first one being communication from external network. So we're going to click next here. We're going to keep everything the same. It's medium. Now, as we start cleaning this up, we may want to consider moving this to high, but we're not there yet. We're going to hit save, and we've fixed our first policy. So I'm going to go back to all events. We know we fixed our policy that's out there, and we have a lot of events. We have 66 total events out there for this communication from external. So one of the fast ways we can do this, and there's not a select all, unfortunately, that's something I wish they would add as well. But if I click the first one and I scroll all the way down to the bottom one, and all I'm going to make sure is that I don't truly have external networks talking to internal networks really quickly. And even if we did and we resolved these, that would be okay because they'll come back in again. All right, so I'm going to hold down my shift key. I'm going to go to the very last one and I'm going to click. So now what I'm going to do to have all these selected, I'm going to go to bulk actions. I'm going to say resolve. And in the comments, I'm going to say updated policy. And I'm going to resolve these. So this resolved all of our selected events. But what you'll notice here is our status changed to resolve, but they're all still here. So the next thing I want to do to make sure that these clean up is I'm going to change this filter. And I'm going to say I only want to see items that are not resolved. There. Now we get a better view. But it sees we don't have anything in here. So I'm going to go to policy name. And click on the second icon that comes up. I'm going to say select all and I'm going to apply. All right. Now, I don't know if you remember, but we also, when we saw the problem in our policies for external, that policy had turned itself off. So we're going to go in and we're going to turn this policy back on. And hopefully it stays on now that we fixed that policy. And it looks like it's staying on. So if we go to all events now and I do external, we're not seeing any from external. Well, actually there's one in here. We see this one down here. So let's go to our policy name and let's see if this is real. So from external. So it looks like we have a couple in here that we're still picking up, but we have a 10, 10, 11, that came in that's talking to 10-100. So if you remember, our 10-100 is our monitored network, but 10-10 is not. So it truly, this is a real event that's happened. Something on a business network or a management network is coming in and talking to this destination. It looks like it's over DNS, so it must be something that's reaching internally to look at our DNS. This could be something like an AD server that was syncing to push down DNS structure. This could be a lot of different things that are happening over this, and because it's UDP, we don't necessarily see that traffic really well, but this looks like it's a legitimate event that needs to be investigated. All right, so now we want to do the same thing as we did before. So I'm going to go to select all under our policies, and we see all of these policies communication to an external network. And we see the same problem here, 192.168, 136, talking to 136. Well, 136 isn't even in our range. So we need to fix this policy just like we did the other one. So I'm going to click on this. We'll see that it's turned itself off. We're going to go to edit, and we're going to change, instead of saying the source is any asset, right? We don't really want to track any asset that's talking to outside. We only want to track things that are in the monitored network. So I'm going to go in and type the first 3 letters in the search. I'm going to say monitored assets network. We're going to hit next, and we're going to hit save. All right. Now that means we can go back to all events, select the first one. I'm going to hold down shift and grab the last one. Perfect. We're going to go to bulk actions. We're going to resolve. We're going to say policy update, and we're going to resolve these as well. We can go back. We'll select everything and say apply. And now you'll see that our communications to and from are actually cleaned up. Now the last thing that we want to do for this policy is go in and enable this policy. So I'm going to go and enable my communication to now. And hopefully this one stays on as well with no additional errors. We'll give it a little bit of time. You may have to do this 2, 3, 5, 7, 10, 20 times. Because what you'll find out is like, oh, I need to add this additional network to my monitored network. Or maybe you have to go do some investigation. So now if I go back to all events, and I see here, for example, I have a 10.111.1.17 talking to 10.100. And it's talking over 443. So maybe we realize that, oh, 10.111.1.17 is actually a jump station, and that's how we're doing the recording that we do today. So this tells us that, oh, well, maybe that should be okay. So in some of the future areas we're going to be talking about is how do you now that it's legitimate traffic, or maybe it's not. In our next episode, we'll start covering how to create groups and how to modify these policies with our groups so that we say this is legitimate traffic while not adding them to our overall asset settings that we have below. So I hope you've enjoyed the episode. If you have any questions or comments, please post them below, and I'll see you in the next episode.